Morris on Beethoven. We understand that Edmund Morris is going to be playing piano during his presentation. We are bringing you 8 hours of coverage, live coverage of today's events, and bringing you a live talk with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Doris Kearns Goodwin a little bit later. She'll discuss her book, The Team of Rivals, about Abraham Lincoln. After that, Dora Bush Cook, the sister of President George W. Bush. She'll be introduced by her brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush. And today's events at Miami-Dade College, expected to draw hundreds of thousands of visitors. As I said, 270 authors, some 250 exhibitors. The fair began back in 1984. It drew about 25,000 people then. Hundreds of thousands are expected during this weekend.
Diane got you all set up there. So, well, you got a space. There's more people in there, so not a lot of room.
Hi.
It's possible that they come across the house.
And we're back live now, preparing to bring you a panel on writing biography. It'll feature author, journalist, and critic Christopher Hitchens, novelist and National Book Award finalist Francine Prose, and Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Edmund Morris. This panel is one of many that are part of this year's 23rd annual Miami Book Fair International. Once again, we're preparing you to listen to a biography panel with author, journalist, and critic Christopher Hitchens, novelist and National Book Award finalist Francine Prose, and Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Edmund Morris. A little bit later during our live coverage of Miami Book Fair International, we'll have Pulitzer Prize-winning author Doris Kearns Goodwin. She'll discuss Abraham Lincoln and her book, The Team of Rivals. And after that, Dora Bush Cook, the sister of President George W. Bush. She will be introduced by her brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush. Live coverage of Miami Book Fair International continuing here on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm very pleased to see you all here for what's going to prove to be quite an interesting presentation. While we were organizing, you saw us bring out the piano, and we hope we'll have a little musical interlude. I want to ask you that, to be sure that we don't have any musical interlude from the audience, so please turn off your cell phones, beepers, whatever else makes noise. And I hope that you've enjoyed the fair so far. It's a wonderful, wonderful fair. This is our 23rd year. I don't want to say best. I just want to say we're maturing beautifully. It is my pleasure to introduce a real friend of the fair. James Atlas of Atlas Books will present our next authors. Thank you.
Don't be shy. They're shy. They'll be here in a second. I promise. They've never done this before. Yeah. First of all, I want to say I want to thank Mitchell Kaplan for putting together this astonishing fair. Astonishing fair. We were talking before, all the writers who hang around waiting to go on in the green room, about how much we love to come here, and we've all managed to wangle invitations year after year now. I told Mitch I just have to come every year until the end of eternity. And we get to sit around and visit among ourselves before going out to speak to this very appreciative public, which always amazes me. There was an article in the Herald, in the Miami Herald this morning, I don't know if you saw it, all about the end of literature by some very crabby guy who I hope isn't in the audience, and who wrote for the Herald for many years, about the literature is no longer important and no longer matters. But an audience like this disproves it. And so I'm very grateful to have you here. It's hard to talk about this, to introduce these panelists in a regular way with all their achievements enumerated, because first of all, if I did that, we'd be here for the better part of the hour while I was just reciting their books. And also, I know them so well. I've known them for as long as I can remember, especially Francine, who published her first novel, Judah the Pious, when she was barely out of college. And she was the first novelist I ever knew, first real novelist, and has been writing steadily ever since, disproving the idea that you can't be, but perhaps single-handedly disproving the idea that you can't be a person of letters in America, because over the last, I hate to say this, 30-some years, Francine has written many novels, nonfiction. Her most recent book just out, which was on the bestseller list, called Reading Like a Writer, and its title makes it very clear what it's about. And journalism, essays, and reviews. And I was just saying to her before, she's never written anything as a hack. It's all excellent, top-flight literary work. And she said the reason for that is that she refused an invitation from Vice magazine to write for them. And so I also know them because I'm the publisher of their most recent books, and I see these books arrive at a certain point in their gray boxes. I'm always amazed. These are always professionals. They turn in their books on time, and they're excellent. With Edmund Morris, we talked about this book on Beethoven for quite a few years, as I recall, and he is, of course, famous as a presidential biographer, but he had a great passion for music and had always wanted to write about Beethoven, and nearly became, if I'm correct, a concert pianist. You probably regret that you ended up as a writer instead. It's a terrible way to make a living. And so finally the moment came when I invited him to write this book, and he drew upon a lifetime of thinking about music, thinking about Beethoven, and wrote a really lovely book. And Christopher Hitchens is, well, he's Christopher Hitchens. For those of you who watch TV ever, or read a magazine ever, or frequent any section of any bookstore, you'll know his work. Last time I was on a panel with you, it was about Saul Bellow, Hitch, and you got into a huge argument with Cynthia Ozick about Israel, and didn't say anything about Bellow. So I want you to stick to the topic today. The topic is biography. And Christopher has his next book coming out, should be very bland and uncontroversial. God is Not Great. So we'll see that in May. If I could just say, embarrassingly, a few promotional words about this series. The Eminent Lives is a series of short biographies by distinguished writers on great canonical figures in history, religious, cultural, literary, political. And it's the sequel to the Penguin Lives that I started a decade ago or so. It has emerged as a popular form, at least among writers, and actually among readers too, I'm glad to say, because while taking a break from the monolithic works that they write, they're encouraged to write a short book of 40 or 50,000 words that just engages them in a very different way, and that enables them to write about what I would call an obsession of theirs. It comes very easily to them. When I ran into Francine at a book fair somewhere when I was just starting this series, I said, "Who would you like to write about it?" And without any hesitation, she said, "Caravaggio." And it was the same with Edmund and Beethoven. And with Christopher, as he just reminded me, I came up with the idea of Thatcher for some reason, and he wasn't too keen on that. And then I came up with the idea of Jefferson, and that seemed to be just right for him. And he did a marvelous book in the space of some months. I don't quite know how. Just if I could say one more word about these short biographies, it's a form that emerges out of a tradition of English literature that begins with Samuel Johnson's Lives of the Poets and continues on through Lytton Strachey's Eminent Victorians. Also, the book that I was reading when I thought up this idea, when I was on page 1,000 of my own biography of Saul Bellow, thought there's got to be some other way to do this. I was reading a short biography by Macaulay on Boswell, and it's a very congenial form. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you what the experience was like of writing a short biography and what it was that impelled you to this subject, and then we can focus on some other issues related to biography. So I'm going to sit down and let Christopher speak first.
Well said. Well, I just wondered if it wouldn't be a good moment to say all the things that I had meant to say about Saul Bellow.
God, no, I said them all.
I can remember. No, I can remember what I fully intended to say. Well, I think it is in fact Lord Byron who says of the span of our species, the span of a human life, he said, is like the summer of a dormouse. And one of the things I find reading most biographies, though not in writing the one I did, is the discovery that you're bound to make of how few years in most people's lives are worth paying any attention to, how many of them are well spent or interesting or rewarding either for them or for anybody else. But the dormouse problem doesn't come up in the case of our third president, Thomas Jefferson, because, and it also, this is an additional reason why it was a very challenging project. He lived to be well over 80, as you know. For more than more than 20 years, nearly 25 continuously, he was actually in power. Once he goes off to be our minister in Paris, until the end of his second term as president, he's almost permanently at the very center of power. That's not true of George Washington, for example. It's not true of Abraham Lincoln. It's not true of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to have this extraordinary span of time at the head of the nation's affairs. And that's after he's been governor of Virginia, author of the Declaration of Independence. And it's before he does the Jefferson Bible, which, if you don't know, I'll just tell you, consists of taking the New Testament in one hand and a razor blade in another, and cutting out all the bits that are either wicked or fanciful or stupid or incredible or mythological or absurd or contradictory, leaving you with a very slender book which you can still get for free from the Unitarian Church, but which used to be given to all members of Congress as a present the first day they showed up for work. So it's an extraordinary life, and the job of condensation was extremely difficult for me, but very fascinating, because the reason I said yes to Jim as soon as he asked me was, well, of course I will, because whatever else one is writing about, one is always writing about Thomas Jefferson, at least when you're writing about the United States, which is the great subject for any writer. You're writing about him because of nation building, because of constitution writing, because of the concept of America as an empire, because of American expansionism, because of the idea of democracy, and of course because of the theory and practice of slavery, and because of the wall of separation between church and state. Any time we care to speak or choose to dilate on any of these topics, we're talking about Thomas Jefferson. And thus, I decided I would call the book The Author of America, in that America is itself a written work in progress. It's based on written documents which are subject to revision and have been very importantly and very dramatically revised, and that's the other reason why America is such a great subject for a writer, because it's a written and a writerly enterprise to begin with. I shouldn't trespass much more on the answer to the first question, except to say one thing, I think, maybe conceivably two. One is, last time I did a panel on this, Michael Corder was of the company, and he said, here's one thing a biographer must never do. You must never say about some contingency or some conjuncture, well, at this moment, so-and-so must have thought or must have felt. Or never do that, never make that assumption. You're not entitled to it. You don't know that. You shouldn't pretend that you do, even if you think you know more about the subject than anybody else. And I heartily concurred, and I thought it was completely right. I'd heard the thought before, had the thought myself, except that I realized that when Thomas Jefferson saw Sally Hemings, not for the first time, because she was a little girl, but for the second time, when she showed up in her early teens in France, I think he thought to himself and said to himself, possibly for the first and only time, there is a God. Aside from that, I think my summary injunction would be about the letter to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, in which the wall of separation is first suggested, because they wanted protection. By the way, guess from whom? The Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut. Who do they want protection from? The Congregationalists of Danbury, Connecticut. That's why a secular state is necessary to guarantee religious pluralism, so I'll just end by saying, Mr. Jefferson, build up that wall. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. That's very nice. Edmund, on you next.
Well, I must say I identify with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, because this morning in the elevator, Meg Tilly spoke to me. And I knew without doubt that there, contrary to what Christopher will be saying in his forthcoming book, there is a God. I fell in love with her when I first saw The Big Chill 15, 20 years ago, and she's as beautiful now as she was then, and she's appearing, I believe, at this festival at 2 o'clock this afternoon. So that's made the journey worthwhile, if nothing else, for me. Jim passed over rather briefly the protracted negotiations which produced my little biography of Beethoven. He indeed came to me and said, "Do you want to write one of these short biographies?" And I said, "Yes, and I'd rather like to do one about Ludwig van Beethoven." He said, "Well, it's going to be a difficult sell, you know, to my backers because books on composers don't do all that well." And he went to talk to his backers, and surely enough, he came back and said, "I'm sorry, they don't want to do it." He said, "Do you want to do anyone else?" I said, "Oh, all right. How about Ingmar Bergman?" He said, "Well, he's kind of Swedish, and I don't know." Sort of passé. So I said, "All right, I'll do Evelyn Waugh. What about that?" He said, "Well, he's kind of English." So I walked off in a huff. And a year later, he came back. He said, "Do you still want to do Beethoven?" I said, "Yes, please." So he hauled out this contract for $250 and unscrewed his fountain pen. He said, "Now, before I sign it, what will the subtitle be?" I said, "Subtitle? Are you kidding? Beethoven needs a subtitle?" He said, "Well, it's the format of the series. We've got to have a subtitle." Well, I needed the $250. So I said, "All right, what about Beethoven? Deaf but not dumb." Which for a moment I think he took seriously, but we compromised eventually on Beethoven, the universal composer. I called him the universal composer because of all the great composers, Beethoven is the only one whose popularity has increased right from the moment he was first recognized as a composer of the first quality in Vienna in the late 18th century. Beethoven's fame grew and grew and grew through his own lifetime. He lived just 56 years. And it continued to mushroom after his death. Unlike Johann Sebastian Bach, who was largely forgotten after his death for half a century, unlike Mozart, who was prettified by the Victorians and miniaturized, unlike all the other great composers one can think of, Beethoven's reputation has continued to increase at a proportionate rate ever since his death in 1827. Last year, the BBC radio, third program in Britain, for the first time in its history, did a 2-week, wall-to-wall, 24-hour-a-day symposium on Beethoven, playing all his works, interspersing lectures and readings. And during the course of this Beethoven fortnight, as they called it there, reviving the beautiful old English word fortnight, they offered free downloads of any Beethoven symphony to any listener around the world. And they got 1.5 million downloads, most of which came in from Asia, which proves, I think, that Beethoven speaks loudly, more loudly now than he has ever done in the past, and the universal quality that speaks to us, that speaks to the Chinese, that speaks to Africans, is particularly vital now because we live in a world which seems to be increasingly a world consisting of chaos. To use a phrase of Evelyn Waugh's, it is chaos that shrieks about our ears. And in a chaotic time, such as the one we live in, Beethoven's philosophy of struggle, all his great works, all his works, synthesize chaotic elements, bring them together with this superhuman strength, pull them apart, force them together again into a resolution at the climax of the work which seems to be elemental, indestructible. Beethoven speaks to us in this constructive language more powerfully today than ever before. A case in point, even though it's somewhat dated, occurs in the prologue to my book, where I used an incident in February of 1978. I happened to be up at Harvard researching my book on Theodore Roosevelt when Massachusetts disappeared under the worst blizzard in its history. They still talk about it to this day. For 3 or 4 days, the entire state, and most of the Northeast, was inundated in a weight of snow. The whole state was paralyzed. No light, no power, no food, no movement, no sound. And on the 3rd day of this paralysis, the sun finally came out. And students emerged from the buildings in Harvard Yard and began to ski across the 6-foot deposit of snow. And the sun was shining and the air was bright. I stood up to my hips in snow watching this return of life, and some anonymous person threw open the windows of his dorm room, put a pair of stereo speakers on the windowsill, and blasted out into the sunshine the finale of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Bum, 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 ba-rum, bum, 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 bum. And everybody stood transfixed for the 10 minutes that this music lasted. And when it ended with 48 thunderclaps of C major, quite a few of us were crying. It just seemed, I don't know what possessed this person to play that music, but nothing so perfectly expressed the feeling we all shared. Look, we have come through. We were buried. We have emerged. Thank you.
Now, Edmund, I don't dispute your account of what actually happened.
You don't?
I can't because it's true. But the problem is that it shows me how difficult it is to know or remember anything about anyone or any event that happened, which is a real liability for a biographer. And but I'm sure, but everything you did say was true, and I've managed to elide that into, I suggested, or came to Edmund and asked him who he wanted to do, and he said Beethoven, and that was that. And it's kind of easier. That's why I like these short biographies. You just can leave out all the things that you forgot or that traumatized you or that you don't want to write about. Francine.
One of the reasons that I was drawn to the form of a short biography, or to be, I guess you could say, a short biographer, was that I have many close friends, Jim included, who are long biographers. And I saw over the years how they suffered. The years it took, the disenchantment, the work, the doubts. And above all, what I noticed, and Jim may be an exception, was how rarely, by the end of the project, their enthusiasm and their affection for their subject had persisted through the project. Often they just hated the person they were writing about by the end of the biography. And I would have hated for that to happen for me with Caravaggio, because he is and was, and I am happy to say continues to be, my favorite painter. I mean, I came to the book out of great passion for Caravaggio's work, and also, as I noticed when I would go to see museums here and churches in Europe, there were always crowds in front of his paintings, and I began to realize that passion was shared, and that he seemed to me an extremely modern painter. Since Edmund has told his celebrity proximity story, I'll tell mine, which was I gave a talk about Caravaggio at the Metropolitan Museum about 6 months ago, and the actor who played Furio in The Sopranos was there and came and got his book signed, and said that I'd done a very good portrait of Naples from where he came, and I thought, that's it. I can just quit right now. The other thing about Caravaggio was that he seemed to me a perfect subject for a brief life because he had such a brief life himself. He only lived to be 39 years old. And it was a life that was perfect for a novelist to write about. I mean, he was not only a genius and a great artist, but he was also a criminal and a murderer. And he committed a murder 4 years before he died, and then was on the run for the last 4 years of his life. And his life was the most dramatic. I mean, just telling the story of his life was incredibly satisfying for a novelist. I'll conclude by telling you that a story that to me illustrates the extent to which my affection for Caravaggio continued to the end and through the end of the project. About a year ago, I was in Rome and at a dinner party, and it was a very long dinner party at which many, many bottles of wine were drunk. And the other guests were all Russian painters. So as you can imagine, after the wine, then a bottle of vodka was suddenly produced, and tequila and so forth, which may explain why at some point I found myself having a conversation with a friend of mine, a Russian painter, about which was the greater artist, Mel Gibson or Caravaggio. And my friend Matvey said, okay, I'll give you this. He said, Mel Gibson was a bad artist and Caravaggio was a great artist, but they were both interested in violence. And I kind of got on my high horse and I said, yes, well, Mel Gibson was in favor of capital punishment and Caravaggio was not. And my friend said, yes, but Mel Gibson didn't actually kill somebody, and Caravaggio did. And I said, he did? I'd written the book. I knew perfectly well that he did. I had written in detail about the murder, but by then, still, my love for Caravaggio was so intense that the fact that he was a murderer had just somehow gone out of my mind. Thank you.
Francine, in regard to your comment about how one ends up hating one's subject if you write a very long biography, let me just say as a perpetrator of one of these books that if you spend 12 hours a day for 10 years with your subject, which is far in excess of what you spend with even your child or your spouse, you end up having a real problem. No one should know anyone that well. It's a real liability. But you know, one thing I wanted to discuss was the relationship of the biographer to the subject. I was talking to Edmund while we were waiting to go on here this morning about his biography of Reagan, which I think is just a fantastic book and was praising mightily. And I recall that there was a traumatic moment when reviewers protested the fact that Edmund had put in a fictional character to this otherwise incredibly vivid, non-fictional narrative. And he said, we all biographers put in this fictional character, only he did it explicitly. And I found that fascinating. I wonder if you could expatiate on that a little bit, because what you meant, of course, was that that the biographer has a point of view, whether it's acknowledged or not, and a very strong point of view.
Well, the biographer does, in effect, become an observer of, a participant in the life of his or her subject. As Francine just indicated, sometimes the relationship becomes quasi-amorous.
Not in my case.
Sometimes it's quite the contrary. The relationship becomes so fraught as with the example of Lawrence Thompson and Robert Frost, where during the course of 3 volumes he discovered that this man he worshipped so much was a monster, and that the more he read Frost's letters, the more he detested him. So the book, the 3rd volume, becomes a diatribe which is almost unreadable. The emotional quotient had become so high, so we all become involved in the lives of our subjects. And the ideal biographical stance is one of mild affection. Love is dangerous, hatred is poisonous. But some affection, mild affection, should be there. Otherwise, it's not much fun to spend 7 or 14 years in the company of this person. Also, going through the letters of, interviewing the children of, studying the life of, listening to the recordings of this person, one becomes almost a participant in the life. I happen to be a participant in Reagan's life in the sense that I was able to go to the White House during his presidency and be with him and interview him and observe him and follow him around, and I developed a closeness of POV, of the point of view, that was so close that I began to feel the absence of that closeness when I went back to earlier parts of his life when I wasn't actually there. So I decided to make explicit what is implicit in all biographies, and that is put myself in the form of a fictitious observer into Reagan's early life, a person of whom he was always unaware, as Reagan tended to be of everybody, and preserve this closeness of view all the way through. It was a technique that I realized would be controversial, and certainly didn't prove to be so, but I do think that it was an honest device, and I'm kind of encouraged to notice that other writers have moved in similar directions since. For example, Andrew Motion, who's the poet laureate of Great Britain, after Dutch was published, came out with a book on Thomas Wainwright, the romantic poet who was involved in a murder case and was transported to Australia. And Andrew Motion wrote this very scholarly book as an autobiography. It's written in Wainwright's own voice. And at the end of every chapter, Andrew Motion gets into a debate with his narrator. So it's a postmodernist technique that I think is honest and exciting, and I think it'll be followed by more such experiments.
Yes, you know Peter Ackroyd in his biography of Dickens, where he
That's right.
emulates Dickens and converses with Dickens, and it's another way of approaching the subject, in some ways enviable, because you can just make it up. Christopher.
Well, I think it's not so necessary even to affect neutrality. For example, Thomas Carlyle, when he set out to do Cromwell, was self-consciously trying to do a rescue operation on a reputation. He said, dragging him out, as he put it, from underneath a heap of dead dogs and carrion in order to sort of dust him down and dispel this terrible cloud of slander that had accumulated. And I think in Isaac Deutscher's wonderful 3-volume biography of Leon Trotsky, I'm fairly sure he starts by saying he wants to do for Trotsky what Carlyle did for Cromwell. And as long as this is openly admitted, I think that's perfectly fine. I only know it from the opposite standpoint, because one of the reasons I said no to your proposal about Thatcher was that I had, when young, had a very, very brief and very unsatisfactory sexual encounter with her. But I wasn't completely certain that this wouldn't sort of taint the whole thing. But the other time that I had to do a study of a person, there's a living one. It wasn't exactly a biography, but it's an extended political profile and inquiry into the life and indeed the crimes of Henry Kissinger. And by the time I was finished with that, I felt as if I'd got gangrene. I can tell you, if you, so to speak, get up in the morning with Henry and then go to bed still thinking about him over an extended period, it will make you sick. And when people come to me and ask me to sign the book and say they want to read or they have read, I say, well, did it make you feel ill? That's my test for this book. Have I passed on at least some of the feeling of nausea and disgust? And usually, yes, I have managed to offload some of it. But it's written, I must tell you, with a tone of perfect detachment and neutrality.
As always, with you. You know, I didn't know about Thatcher, by the way. That's.
I must tell you sometime.
You know, it occurs to me, thinking about our three biographers here, that your subjects, and by the way, you wrote about Kissinger with distinct antipathy, but with great sympathy for Orwell and Jefferson, your two other subjects.
Yes, I have an answer now to I used to get approached by motherly ladies in bookstores when I did signings. And they would be worried, and they'd come up to me and say, you know, don't you like anybody? As if I was so secretly unhappy and venting. And I said, no, look, I've written all these furry books about people who I like and who I think are sweet.
Yeah, but Christopher, let's not forget about Mother Teresa. This is a guy who did a tear-down job on Mother Teresa.
Well, the bitch had been asking for that for a long time.
It's an easy target.
What is that?
I said she's an easy target.
Easy target. Push it.
But, God, I didn't know this was going to turn into a sitcom here this morning. I feel like I have Seinfeld up here. But in any event, one of the things that interested me about among the many things about your biography of Jefferson was that you have a great love affair with America and have written many essays about that. And of course, you view this from the perspective of an expatriate who has now become an American citizen. Is that right?
Yeah, well, yes.
And so I always think that there is some very distinct point of view that enables one to, as it were, solve problems, solve issues, express issues in your own life without being too Freudian about it. But Francine's subject is also very different from anything you've written, and Edmund's emerges out of your lifelong passion for music. It interests me that you chose these subjects. Why is it? What is the appeal of someone who is so far, in a way, from your own experience, and yet answers so deeply to questions in your own life? Maybe you could address that first.
Well, it's true that if one believes, as I do, I've come to believe, that the American Revolution is the only revolution left, the only one still standing, the only one with any life or vigor in it, the only one that could be emulated with profit by another culture or another people, then it is very important to understand what the theory of that revolution was, and it's best articulated by Thomas Jefferson and by my next subject, Thomas Paine, who was a great Englishman, as well as a great American. That's really what fascinated me about them. And then, of course, you have to try and see it from the point of view that they did, which is they were the first people really we know about ever in history to be given a new canvas with which to start. The Comtesse Dudetot said to Thomas Jefferson that she hugely envied him because the revolutionaries in France had this Augean stable of misery and poverty and hatred and repression and exploitation that they had to clear. And the United States revolutionaries didn't have that. They could begin de novo. And that was the wonderful refreshment of the American Revolution. Then, of course, if you don't say this, someone's going to ask you, well, in that case, what about slavery? What about, if you like, the original sin or the original stain? And I suppose the saddest thing for me writing about Jefferson, because of course I knew all that, was that bad as it was much worse than I had realized, in that not only does Jefferson fail to abolish slavery, in fact he decides to postpone the whole idea of abolition for reasons that must have seemed realistic enough to him. He more or less consciously gifts this horrible legacy to the next generation. I had thought that that was roughly as bad as it was. I mean, he kept it going. He missed the chance to abolish it. He missed the chance to not extend it to the Louisiana territories, the purchase of which was his idea and Thomas Paine's idea. But what I hadn't appreciated was that he extended and deepened the hold of slavery as well. He made certain that it went into the new territories over the objections of people like Paine and Barlow. By the way, not to get carried away with this, but a thing you're sometimes told is you mustn't judge by contemporary standards. A biographer mustn't impose, as it were, our prejudices or our wisdoms on the past. I often think that's false friendship as an advice, as a piece of advice, because there were people like Joel Barlow and Thomas Paine who thought exactly about slavery as we like to think we do, and who tried to say to Jefferson, don't do this, Mr. President. We can begin again with Louisiana without this terrible system. But by agreeing to do it, he made sure, absolutely sure, not just that there would be a protracting of the institution and a deepening and extension of it, he made certain there would be a civil war about it. And I hadn't really appreciated that the situation had been as grave as that.
No, but he was a slave owner, but he was not a murderer. So unlike Caravaggio, who you had to overlook this minor characterological.
Or Henry Kissinger.
I just kind of forgot that it happened.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, in the back of my mind, or the front of my mind, the whole time I was writing about Caravaggio, was the kind of the larger abstract question of why certain works of art endure, and how certain works of art continued to speak to us over time and centuries. So a particular problem writing about Caravaggio is that so little was known about his life. I mean, he left no journals, he left no letters, he left no preparatory drawings, and most of what we know about Caravaggio, in fact, comes to us through police reports, court depositions, complaints of his neighbors, and so forth. So, so really, all I could do, or what I mainly did, was look at the paintings. And I thought the longer I look at these paintings and the harder I think about these paintings, the more I'm going to know about Caravaggio. And in fact, there's a very kind of intimate communication with the painter that does occur, aided by the fact that he put self-portraits into so many of his paintings. And when you look at you know, the great, famous David with the head of Goliath, which was one of his final paintings, and he's holding, the young David is holding the head of Goliath, and in fact, it's a double self-portrait. It's the young Caravaggio and the old, wounded Caravaggio. And if you look at that picture long enough, I think that you do figure out certain things about its creator, and those were things I tried to put into the book.
Yeah, and Edmund, you also stressed the sense of universality, and I wonder if it's a virtual requirement of a biography that the subject have that kind of range, that you really are able to express through your subject the same kinds of universal feelings that a painter would, or a composer.
Well, all men contain multitudes. I think it's quite possible. In fact, it's often been proven that you can write a biography of the highest literary and scholarly quality about somebody who was not universal, somebody who might be indeed rather minor. For example, A.J. Simon's book, The Quest for Corvo, a book which is about the pursuit of, the recovery of an almost forgotten minor figure in British literary history, and it turned out to be one of the most fascinating biographies ever written.
Now, he was minor, but J.A. Ackerley wrote My Dog Tulip, right? He wrote a biography of his dog. Mm. So, and Virginia Woolf wrote a fictional biography of her dog. So I guess you can write about anyone. I have been thinking about since our hour, amazingly enough, is nearly up. Yeah, I know, we do talk on. It's been very entertaining. I was thinking, should we have questions, or should we, what is that sentence you quoted to me before about when we've spoken enough?
I was saying when people run out of things to say, they usually turn to music, because music takes off where words fail. But personally, I think music would be inappropriate at this time. Why don't we just have a few questions?
I was hoping you'd do the closing statement.
Oh, come on, Edmund. You said it should be spontaneous.
Well, look, all I will do is illustrate a major theme of the book, which is that Beethoven, as everybody knows, was deaf, became deaf in his late 20s, began to become deaf, and suffered excruciating from tinnitus through his 30s until he became so deaf that the only way you could communicate with him was to write questions on paper. Now, the confession that he had tinnitus made me examine his music to see if perhaps the pathology of tinnitus, the chimings, the roarings, the buzzings in his ears might have somehow come out to produce these very weird sound effects you do get occasionally in Beethoven, frequently in Beethoven. And I talked about this to the American Association of Neurological Surgeons in New Orleans a couple of years ago, and happened to mention this idea of mine, and one of the neurologists got up and said, "Mr. Morris, I have myself begun to lose my hearing, and I'm studying the phenomenon of deafness." And he said, "I can only tell you that the opening bars of the Ninth Symphony, that long, sustained, hovering fifth, that throbbing is exactly what you hear when you're beginning to lose your hearing." So if you insist, I could demonstrate at least one passage in Beethoven.
Do the closing of the fifth. You will, right? Do that.
I can't do that.
Promise. You will do the closing of the fifth as well.
Illustrates, it's from the recitative at the beginning of the slow movement of Beethoven's Piano Sonata in A-flat major, opus 110.
How about that? Well done. Good for you.
I was scared there. Yeah. Oh, this huge audience.
That A, that reiterated A, shrieks in his music. He uses it, I think, 75 times at the finale of the Ninth Symphony. I have no proof of it, but I'm quite sure that derived from his tinnitus. Another composer, Friedrich Smetana, actually wrote a string quartet. He also went deaf in his late years, in which, in the last movement, it's suddenly interrupted by this penetrating, shrill, high E, which was directly related to the sounds in his head. So it's a theory, and what the hell.
Thank you all very much.
What about the Fifth Symphony that he's Thank you.
wrapping up the author panel on biography here at the 23rd Annual Miami Book Fair International. Live pictures from the room in Chapman Hall on the campus of Miami-Dade University. Christopher Hitchens, a member of the panel we just heard from, has been a columnist at Vanity Fair, The Nation, and Slate, an occasional contributor to several other publications. He's attended Cambridge and Oxford, and among his books, Thomas Jefferson, Author of America, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, and Prepared for the Worst. And Edmund Morris is best known for his biographies of American presidents. His biography, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, won the Pulitzer Prize and American Book Award in 1980. He was, for a short time, President Reagan's authorized biographer and published the national bestseller Dutch, a memoir of Ronald Reagan, in 1999. He has written on travel and the arts for The New Yorker, The New York Times, and Harper's Magazine. We are bringing you live coverage of today's events all day here on Book TV, and coming up shortly, we'll take you to an author panel on